Raspberry questions are among the most common ones that I get in my office. One of the best things that you can do for your berries is planting them in a good site to begin with. So you want to make sure that they have full sun. 6 hours is the bare minimum, 8 to 10 would be better. You also want to make sure that you plant them in good soil. They particularly like good drainage, so sandy loams to loamy sands are good soils to plant them in. If you plant them in heavy clay, they are very susceptible to getting root rot diseases. Berries do like high organic matter, at least between 2 and 6% for raspberries, and it's a good idea to get a soil test to start out with so you know what your organic matter level is. If your soil test says that you need to go ahead and add some organic matter, compost is a good thing to add, and it's best if any amendments that you add, such as compost, are incorporated into the soil a season before planting. You also want to check in your soil test what your pH is. If your pH is too high, that can have a deleterious effect on your raspberries, so you want to make sure that your pH is in a good range. So the other thing that you want to do to prepare your site is to control perennial weeds in particular. Perennial weeds can be such a problem because they tend to spread from underground rhizomes. Of course, they come back every year. And if you try and get rid of them by cultivation, if you cut up those roots, what tends to happen is that you actually increase your population because they can sprout from those cut roots. Also, cultivation tends to bring up weed seeds, whether from annual or perennial weeds, and so you may need to do a couple cycles of cultivation, then weeding out whatever grew up before you actually want to go ahead and plant in that area. The other option, of course, is using non-residual herbicides, something like Roundup that stays in the plant but doesn't stay in the soil for particularly long periods of time. Now, if you have primarily annual weeds, those can be killed by solarization using clear plastic or black plastic to smother them. It's not a very successful option, however, in terms of perennial weeds. So a little bit of raspberry anatomy terminology so that you'll know what these terms are when they come up. First of all, there's the crown. That's the area at the base of the plant where the so-called crown buds are located. And the crown buds are what will generate the canes that produce the flowers and fruits. Raspberries are suckering plants. They sucker via these adventitious buds that form on the roots as they spread, and so you can have the buds generating canes several feet away from the main plant. There are two kinds of cane terms that we use. First one is primocane. That's a first-year cane on a summer-bearing raspberry that does not fruit, or a first-year cane on a fall-bearing raspberry that will produce fruit that year. The term floricane is used to refer to an overwintering primocane that fruits the second year on a summer-bearing raspberry, and then it will die after fruiting. Or it refers to an overwintering primocane on a fall-bearing raspberry that partially fruited the year before and will fruit the rest of the way down the cane the second summer and then die after that. Leaves are just called leaves, so that one's pretty easy. And the flowers are born in clusters, which if you've ever looked carefully at a raspberry plant are pretty evident. And another thing to know is that most raspberry plants are productive for the most part in their first 8 to 10 years. So here's an illustration of what some of those terms look like. There is an extra term in here, the tips. The tips are talking about the tips of the canes, whether primocane or floricane, but also it can refer to the tips on the side branches or lateral branches as well. Now, often primocanes will not have a whole lot of side branches on them, but as you can see in the illustration, sometimes they will develop those at the end of the season. Now you can also see from the root system that raspberries are indeed suckering, and you can see the crown buds at the top of the roots where each cane comes up. So a little bit about summer-bearing raspberries. As we mentioned, they fruit on primocanes that have overwintered, so the second year they are of course called floricanes. This is as opposed to fall-bearing or ever-bearing raspberries, as they may be called. Those fruit on primocanes because they're first-year canes, so they produce their fruit the first season, but later in the season than a summer-bearing raspberry. Now, if the primocanes on a fall-bearing raspberry are allowed to overwinter after they produce that crop in late summer and fall, they will produce a small summer crop, and they're called floricanes after they overwinter. Usually we cut them down part way over the winter. Do note, though, that many of the newer fall-bearing cultivars are not really winter hardy, so they actually don't produce a very large summer crop on any of those overwintered floricanes. All right, so a little bit more about summer-bearing raspberries. As we've mentioned, they produce fruit on 2-year-old floricanes. The deal with summer-bearing raspberries is because they have that 2-year life cycle that you have to choose a cultivar that is going to be winter hardy in your area in order to get it to fruit after it's overwintered. Summer-bearing raspberries typically need short days and cooler temperatures to initiate the flowers before the fruits are produced. So they produce one crop in the summer, and then the floricane dies after fruiting. And you can remove the floricanes that have fruited right after they bear, or you can wait until winter and take them out at that time. Usually you don't need to use heading back cuts to control the height unless they've gotten very tall. And if you had that issue, you would be looking at taking out no more than 25% of the cane. Again, new canes are going to sprout from underground root buds, also called crown buds, and they're also called leader buds. You may see that in the literature somewhere. And of course, they do spread over time. So here is a chart of summer-bearing cultivars. You can see that one thing that comes up kind of often is that freezing quality is often related to the firmness of the fruit, so soft fruits typically don't freeze very well. And that's something to keep in mind in terms of your selection of varieties. Also, again, keep in mind your cultivar hardiness. The farther you are up in the state, the colder your winters, and the more important that hardiness factor is. Little bit about fall-bearing raspberries. So the fruit on these is born on those 1-year-old canes. And interestingly, the day length and temperature don't actually affect flower initiation on fall-bearing raspberries. They do initiate their flowers later in June and July, and then you'll see the flowers early in August and September, with the heaviest fruiting occurring in late September and even early October. But they do produce fruits right up until frost. You'll note that the fruiting zone where the fruits are produced starts at the tip, and so that's why when you overwinter them, you typically are going to cut them back from where they fruited, and then you'll get more fruits, although a lighter crop on that cane the next summer if you decide to do it that way. The other thing that you can do if you decide you don't want that lighter cane production the next spring, you can actually just cut them all down at the end of the season. So that's why it says pruning is easier, because you don't have to do it twice if you don't want to have that second crop. Now here's one problem with the fall-bearing raspberry, and we'll talk more about this later. The spotted winged Drosophila, which is a vinegar fly, looks very much like a fruit fly. It's the same genus, and that has become a really big problem in raspberries around the state because their population tends to ramp up about the time that fall-bearing raspberries are really starting to bear. It's become more of a problem than it is on summer-bearing raspberries, but we are not sure that that trend will continue. Here's a list of some fall-bearing cultivars. There are a few blank spots on the chart where I did not have that information available to me, so you might want to keep your eyes open for more information about those particular varieties. Planting raspberries. Most of the time you're going to get your raspberries bare root, although there are some nurseries and garden centers that do offer them in pots, but they are more expensive if they're potted. It's a better deal if you can get a several raspberries together in a group that are bare root. So usually the bare root is going to be offered a little bit earlier in the spring as well, but you need to be sure that you're planting after the danger of frost is over. Now, one thing also about handling bare root plants in general is that sometimes at a nursery and garden center, because it's so busy in the spring, they don't always keep things as moist as they should. So it's really not a bad idea to hydrate the material in a bucket, but you usually don't want to do it for more than an hour or two. You want to plant the raspberries at the same depth that they were in the nursery. Now you're saying, well, how can I do that if it's a bare root plant? Well, usually you'll see kind of a little soil line on those stems. Be sure and check it before you put them in the bucket if you end up rehydrating, so you know where that line was. But usually it's not going to be too far above the root system. You want to make sure when you plant it in the hole that your roots are nice and spread out, that they're not circling around or spiraling around each other. And usually you don't want to do any root pruning unless there are some roots that are excessively long. After you've planted, as you might guess, you want to water those in immediately. One thing about raspberries is, they're not going to be moving around, so unlike annual plants where it's a pain to put in drip tape and then move it every year, because raspberries are perennials, they can be successfully drip irrigated, and there are a number of inexpensive kits that are on the market for home gardeners, so you might want to check that out as an irrigation alternative. Mulching is typically done with raspberries only the first year to help plants get established. Now, on the other hand, if soils are sandy, maybe you want to continue to mulch over time. But on heavier soils, particularly our heavy clay soils, if you use a lot of mulch, it can stay wet too long and encourage root rot. So you might not want to do it past the first year on heavier soils. But for that first year, mulches do help with retaining moisture, protecting roots from heat, and reducing weeds at least somewhat. Usually the material you want to use for mulch is going to be straw or hay. Do ask at the nursery or garden center for clean straw or hay. And often what we use between the rows is going to be sod, but you can also use bark mulch. Do have a couple of examples here of different ways to plant your raspberries. The first one is called the hill planting system, and usually you do hill up the soil a little bit, but what really makes this system different than the one that you will see next is that all the raspberries in a particular group are tied to a vertical post, and then you leave enough space between the plants and posts so that you can harvest all the way around those plants. So usually they suggest a 4x4 spacing. That may be more space than you have available, so you may want to try the next system. This next system is called a row planting system, where in rows you ideally space the plant about 2 to 3 feet apart, which is a little bit narrower than the preceding, and you want to have about 3 to 4 feet between rows. So in this double row system, what you do is you tie the floricanes to these outside wires that you can see. And you can see we've got an example here of the double row system as well as a single row system. And the reason that you tie the floricanes is to make harvest easier, because what will happen is as those floricanes develop fruit, they become heavier and they kind of swing to the outside naturally, those two outside wires, and the primocanes in the center will be more upright. So it's just a little bit easier to harvest that way. So another option if you use the double wires on the ends of the cross arm is to slip the canes in between them, kind of weaving them in and out instead of tying them. Here's an example of a single row system. This is really very simple and works pretty well if you have a fence post that is tall enough. Here's an example of the double row planting system. You do need to, when you have young plants such as in the photo above, make sure that as the canes develop that they are balancing on the outside wires there so that you don't have to move them later when they're stiffer and have a lot more thorns on them. So here's an example of what that should look like in an artist's conception of the primocanes coming up in the centers and the floricanes being tied to the wires on the outside. A little bit about pruning. So with summer bearing raspberries, there are a couple of times that you can prune. The first one is late summer after the floricanes finish bearing, and what you should do is remove those finished floricanes by cutting them right down to the ground level. After all, they're not going to fruit again, and so getting that material out of the way can be helpful. Now if your canes are very thickly together though, you might want to wait until the winter to do this, and part of the reason for that is because you don't want to rip up the existing primocanes, because as you pull them out you're going to probably catch some of the leaves and so on from the primocanes as you pull out the finished floricanes. So our fruit specialist said that unless there are disease issues you can wait until winter to prune. So that dormant season or winter pruning can take place either before the snow comes down when it's pretty late in the fall, like very late November or early December, or you can wait until early spring to do that. You want to do it though before the canes start sprouting. So your goals with the pruning then are to obviously remove any floricanes that flowered last year and fruited last year, but also you want to remove any weak wood or diseased or damaged wood. You want to thin out those primocanes then to about 4 to 6 of them per foot of row. Now this guideline is based on a 12-inch wide row and could limit your yield if you remove too many. So the 4 to 6 guidance works best with larger diameter canes. Some of the cultivars though have smaller canes and need more like 12 to 18 canes left over. So just kind of know which sort of variety you're using. Generally, you don't need to do the heading back like we talked about earlier unless those primocanes get really tall. And so those, if you do need to head them back a little bit, you don't want to do it by any more than 25%. The nice thing about doing it though is that it does encourage more branching, and if you have more branching, you have more branches that can bear fruit. And a little bit more about that dormant season pruning. It can sometimes be a little bit difficult. I mean, it's easy enough to do if you can see the old fruiting structures on the used floricanes. But if you cut them partially back after they fruit during the growing season. Sometimes once it gets to the dormant season, it can be a little bit harder to figure that out. But you can see here from the photo, there is a color difference with the floricanes, and usually the old ones will be have a lot more splits on them, often be more gray or brown, and the newer stems will be kind of more pinkish in color. So do use that as guidance to figure out what to remove. Here's yet another photo of what that might look like, and here the color difference is a little bit easier to see. You can see where the old floricanes are. There's a big color difference there, but remember, you're also needing to prune out so that you have 4 to 6 or 12 to 18, depending on the size of your canes, per foot of row. So in this one, which has larger canes, you can kind of see which ones you might want to remove, including the so-called loser floricane. That would be considered weaker wood, so you would want to take that out. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a visual on what that looks like in terms of removing overall material. So here's thinning canes before, and here is thinning canes after. Now, obviously, this is one of the bigger diameter canes that you would want, 4 to 6 per foot of row. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about pruning fall-bearing raspberries. So this you would need to do in the dormant season, so either late fall or early spring before they've sprouted. And all the canes should be cut back to the ground unless you're pruning for that lighter spring crop. And if that's what you're doing from the floricanes that bloomed last year, you can cut them back by 25 or 50%. Remember, they're not going to bloom on the tips anymore. They're going to bloom on the bottom part of the cane. And then after those finish blooming, you can take them to the ground. So for that light spring crop, if you want to kind of encourage that to occur earlier, you can use floating row cover to hold in some heat and start your harvest 5 to 15 days earlier. But do be sure to remove those covers when the temperatures get to be 80 or the canes get to be 12 to 18 inches in height, whichever comes first. Obviously, you do this way before they start to flower because obviously you're going to need the pollinators to pollinate in order to get that crop. Now, if you decide to cut them all down and that you don't want that lighter spring crop, you can use a mower, but you don't want to use a rotary mower like you would use for your yard. You would want to use what's called a walk-behind sickle mower that has kind of a scissor cut action for this. And there are a couple companies like Jari and Troy-Bilt that will produce those pieces of equipment. So once again, just like with summer bearing, you do thin those canes to 4 to 6 per foot of row, unless it's a small cane variety, and then you want to leave 12 to 18 canes per foot of row. A little bit of humor here in terms of pruning. The idea here is that you want to make sure that your pruning shears are sharp, not only for just making a cleaner cut, but a cleaner cut is less susceptible to disease. Now notice here we've also got a really nice example of some proper and improper cuts. You'll notice on going left to right, the leftmost cane, they left a big stub, and that can allow disease to get in on that stub because the stub is going to die back, and so you can end up with problems that way. Cut number 2 is improper because it is a really severe angle, and that makes a bigger wound than you need. Also, cutting that close to the bud often will make the bud desiccate, and then you have a dead bud and a stub at the same time, so that hasn't helped you out either. So what you want to do is make a cut that's about a 1/4 inch above where that bud comes out, and you want to have a slight angle on it so that water drains off of it. You don't have water sitting and allowing either fungi or bacteria to get a hold there. Now we'll talk a bit about fertility in raspberries. Keeping in mind raspberries are perennial plants. So for each plant you want to use about 4 to 5 pounds of a 10-10-10 fertilizer for each 100 foot of row. What you may want to do is get a hand cranked spreader. You hang it around your neck and it looks sort of like you're an organ grinder, and the fertilizer will come out the bottom, and you can calibrate that for the proper rate. So what you would do is then use that tool to sprinkle your fertilizer in a 3-foot band over the row. It's best to apply in early May. You don't want to apply much later because you don't want to encourage a lot of soft fruit to develop. You want to have your raspberries a little firmer if possible to do that. So if your soil test indicates that you have high phosphorus and potassium levels, you're not going to want to add more. So in that case, you wouldn't want to use a 10-10-10. You'd want to use something that only adds nitrogen. So in that case, you want to use about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of something like urea, that is a nitrogen source, per 100 foot of row instead, and do use the same timing. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that you don't want to over-fertilize with nitrogen because there are several fungal diseases that really are attracted to canes that are soft and lush if you've over-fertilized. Also, don't fertilize after July 1st because, again, this encourages more succulent late season growth that not only is susceptible to disease but also winter damage. New plantings versus established plants, you're going to want to divide the total amount for the season into thirds and apply the first third a couple of weeks after planting, the next third about a month later, and the final third an additional month later. So that would be May, June, and July. And the July one, again, shouldn't be applied any later than July 1st. Now, if you prefer to use an organic alternative to fertilizers that are the conventional types, you can certainly do that. Do keep in mind, though, that because the organic alternatives are usually much less concentrated, you'll need to use a lot more. So if you're using something like manure as an organic alternative, you're going to need to apply 50 to 100 pounds of well-rotted manure, either cow or horse, per 100 feet of row, and then work it lightly into the soil. Now we'll go into some of the insects, and unfortunately there are a few that we have problems with. This year, 2017, we have had a massive resurgence of Japanese beetles, and I've had all kinds of calls from frantic raspberry growers and just general gardeners because the beetles seem to be attacking everything. I wish I could tell you there was a silver bullet to use. Japanese beetles are hard to control because they're around for so long and because you get damage not necessarily on raspberry roots, but on turf roots by the larvae, as well as you have the adults feeding and causing damage. So the nice thing, if you can call it that, is that Japanese beetle damage is typically a little bit less bad on the summer-bearing raspberries because they're just starting to ramp up their population about the time that the summer-bearing ones are starting to bear. Now, if most of the summer-bearing ones have already flowered and started to produce fruit, once those green fruits are starting to develop, because they all pretty much bear at the same time, you can use netting. But you need to make sure that it's got very small holes, and you certainly don't want to trap a lot of beetles underneath the netting. And of course, the Japanese beetles are at their peak when the fall bearing raspberries are blooming and when the flowers need pollinating. So netting usually isn't an option at that point. If you don't have acres and acres of raspberries, you can certainly use hand picking. And I know that's not pleasant. I don't enjoy it either, but I do it. I usually have a bucket of soapy water and or a jar, and I will do my hand picking either after sundown, if possible, or in the early morning before the beetles are really active, and they fall into the bucket a lot easier at that point. If you try and do it at midday, they're just going to fly away, so don't even bother at that point in time. There are some strategies that are focused on adults or grubs, and what I would recommend is that you check out our fact sheet that you can find at the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic. If you just Google UWEX Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic or PDDC and then UWEX, you can find a fact sheet on the insect there. One thing we do recommend is don't use Japanese beetle traps. The research shows that they bring in 4 times as many beetles as you would have had without using the traps. And your neighbors will not be happy with you either for bringing all those into your general area. Now, there is a caveat to this. If you live in a rural area and you can put traps 200 to 300 yards away from the crops that you want to keep the beetles away from, you might be able to use them in that setting. But if you find that it's bringing in more beetles, get rid of them right away. There is also the product called Milky Spore, and unfortunately, that one is not always very reliable. First of all, it's only effective against the grubs, so you need to have a very good population of grubs in order to get the product, the organism that is in that product established. And if you don't have enough grubs, it doesn't spread well enough, and then it doesn't survive. It's also expensive, is another problem with it. So I wish I had better news to report with the Japanese beetles. Another problem that I have seen in my own raspberries fairly commonly is the raspberry cane borer. And the longer you grow raspberries, the more likely you are to see this kind of issue. So the adults, and you can see one there in the center, emerge in June, and they will feed on the shoot tips of the new canes. And the females will actually make some little holes in a ring around the cane. So they actually girdle the tip of the cane, and you can see there in that picture on the left that they've done that in kind of a 1 inch area, or maybe only a half an inch apart, and you can see where the egg laying wound is as well. So if you see those tips bending over like that, you can actually see in that picture on the right where the cane was girdled as well. What you need to do is just cut the cane below where the area, the bottom of the 2 rings is, and that should remove the larva. Now, if you've done it too late in the season, if you've let that sit around for a while, that larva may be working its way down the stem. And in that case, you may lose that cane eventually. So as soon as you see this symptom developing, take care of it right away, because you don't want the larva to burrow down the cane and then into the crown the next year and pupate and then start the whole darn cycle over again. This is becoming the real big problem in our area, is the spotted wing Drosophila. These insects are quite small. They are in the same genus as fruit flies, so of course that's what they look like. You can identify them if you do see them. The male has a dark spot near the tip of each wing. And the female, although you're not going to see it, most likely unless you have a microscope, has a serrated ovipositor. That's that middle picture there. And that's the whole problem with these guys, is that most of the Drosophila that might attack fruit would attack fruit that is already overripe because they can't get their ovipositors in there to lay eggs. But the female of this species, because she has that nice little hacksaw sort of attachment to her ovipositor, is able to saw into fruit that is either just starting to ripen or hasn't quite ripened yet. And so you might not even know that the berries have been attacked for a few days. Sometimes people have actually picked them and processed them and then found out later that as the larvae start to develop that they are there. So what happens is the larvae, and you can see them in that bottom picture, they feed in the fruit. They're quite small, and usually they'll cause that tissue to just liquefy fairly rapidly. And unfortunately, they produce extremely rapidly. They have a generation every 8 to 9 days once they get to the point where they're starting to produce. Now, usually their population doesn't ramp up until about the time that the fall-bearing raspberries are starting to come into production. So usually around the beginning of August, we start to see problems with them. So adults are going to live for about 2 weeks. The females can lay up to 300 plus eggs. So you can imagine the populations can build up just extremely fast. Now there are traps that you can use to monitor the population. You won't be able to trap enough to actually make a dent in the population, but it does tell you when the population is starting to ramp up and what you need to do. So again, if you go to that PDDC site, the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic site, there's information there on making a trap. You can also find that at our Learning Store site. If you go to, or if you just use your browser and put in the search term Learning Store, UWEX, and then search under lawn and garden and fruit. You can also just put into the search box Drosophila, and it should come up with information on that. So one of the controls you can use is a product called spinosad, and that is an organic product based on a bacterium. Pyrethrum is a product that is based on chrysanthemum. It doesn't have a very long residual, however, but you can use either one of those, or probably best for home gardens. So make sure that you follow all the label instructions, because you need to make sure that you have observed a long enough period between when you apply the product and when you harvest the fruit for safety of eating the raspberries. Now when you do apply these products, make sure that you spray really well into the plant canopy, because remember, the adults are mobile, they're flying around, and you want to kill as many of them as possible. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier there, do make sure that that pre-harvest interval has been observed, and that you do read the directions on whatever product you might use. Here's an example of what those traps look like. They're really pretty easy to build. You can make them at home using a 32-ounce cup with a lid. You make some holes around the rim, and you leave one section though that's about 3 to 4 inches without any holes, so that when you tilt the cup and pour the liquid out, that you don't get bugs stuck in the holes there. You can also use a yellow sticky card. This is a really good idea as well, so that you can see kind of the number of flies that you're getting. Do make sure that when you bait this trap that you also use some dish soap in it. Unscented is best, to make sure that the flies don't just fly into the yeast and then fly back out again. The dish soap helps to have an effect on the surface tension and doesn't allow the trapped insects to fly back out again. There's also a commercial trap that you can buy. Several different companies sell these types of traps. Great Lakes is one of the companies, but there are many other companies also. And with both of these, you do want to change your lure on a fairly often sort of basis. You also can add a little bit of borax per gallon of mix to make sure that you don't get a lot of mold in your traps. Okay, now we'll talk about a few diseases that affect raspberries. One of these is root and crown rots, which we tend to see on heavier soils, and particularly during years like we've had in 2016 when it has been very wet outside. So again, heavy soil, poor drainage is going to result in this kind of thing. Also, if you've had poor pruning practices, sometimes you can actually exacerbate these root rot problems. A couple of fungal diseases that you might want to look out for are cane blight, and we do have a fact sheet on cane blight at the PDDC site that you might want to check out. And this is a fungal disease. Spur blight is another fungal disease that you might want to check out some information about. Usually, unfortunately, once a cane is damaged to this degree, cutting it, pruning it out is about the only option that you have. But there are some treatments that can be made prophylactically if you have chronic issues with this. Another disease that's pretty easy to identify because of the characteristic lesions that are formed is anthracnose. And anthracnose is another fungal disease. Fortunately, it's less common on red raspberries than black and purple. But you may get it on infected plants or on nearby infected plants or wild raspberries. It does spread in the spring to new canes by wind and by splashing rain and by insects. The spores will spread very easily that way. Interestingly, although it can affect both leaves and fruits as well, you generally are going to see it most often on the canes. And so what will happen is you will get these kind of ash-colored roundish spots with purple sort of raised purple margins. Now, if you get a severe case, and especially if it happens early enough in the year, you can actually get the spots merging together and actually girdling the canes, and that will kill them. You might also get symptoms where you have bark splitting. Unfortunately, anthracnose is really hard to manage once you see those symptoms starting. You can prune the canes, but that only really helps if the disease levels are pretty low. So the best time to attack this disease is prophylactically, and if you've had problems with it, I do recommend that you use some prophylactic treatments. So if the disease levels are low, however, then you want to prune about 4 to 6 inches below where you see those symptoms, and make sure to disinfect your shears between each cut using rubbing alcohol to kill off any spores. I do recommend rubbing alcohol over using something like a 10% bleach solution because bleach is really corrosive to your tools. Now, also with fungal diseases in general, keeping good air circulation, making sure you're not overhead watering and not over fertilizing with nitrogen also will help somewhat to prevent infection. Anytime you can do anything to increase that air circulation and not have any water on the leaves, which helps to encourage fungi to germinate. If you can keep that plant material dry, that will really help out a lot. So if you do have chronic problems using that preventative fungicide treatment, the nice thing is you only need to do it once, but you do need to do it when the buds are a quarter to a half inch of green tissue. If you wait until they've leafed out, that's too late to do it in the season. But lime sulfur is pretty easy to find. It's fairly inexpensive, and we've given you the recipe to use there. Now make sure when you do apply that you spray down the canes well. So here are some other resources you might want to look into about growing raspberries in our area. Raspberry pest management, cultivar selection, a little bit more about the Drosophila, and these other sorts of diseases. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and you can reach me at my office if you have any further questions about growing raspberries. Thank you very much.